Coming up.
No more oil, no more gas.
When it comes to climate advocacy, I think it's critical. We need climate advocates to make animal agriculture a climate priority, to take on big animal ag, the way they've taken on big oil.
Global food systems face increasing threats from conflicts, pollution, and a heating planet. But what and how we eat bring problems too.
What's your take on this seeming blockage people have in terms of just talking about it? Because it leads to such ferocious discussions.
I don't like vegans very much. I don't think any of you look very healthy.
I'm not surprised by that.
Yeah, I think you all look pretty pasty-faced and unhealthy to me.
Why is it that we can't even agree on the facts? Why is it that people get defensive when this issue comes up? Why is it that this issue isn't included in many important conversations?
And for all the food we put on the table, nearly half of it is produced by women, many of whom in 2024 still do not have fair access to land and loans.
When
they're taking control over the woman's life, they're taking control over her education, they're taking control over her decision making, they're taking control over her land ownership.
Just 2 degrees is on. Now,
People who willfully turn a blind eye to the killing of animals, for whatever reason, are they bad people?
Well, that's a great question.
If you're hungry and can simply click on an app on your phone to order a meal, a drink, a dessert, and all that's an affordable price, and that food arrives in 30 minutes or less, consider yourself food privileged. It's an entirely different situation for people in places like Palestine, Haiti, Mali, both Sudans. Those countries experience famine and require urgent assistance. There are other countries whose food insecurity designations are a bit different. The UN classifies countries like Chad, Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, Somalia, and Burkina Faso as hotspots of high concern, where large numbers of people face or are projected to face critical levels of acute food insecurity. I know the language can be a bit unsympathetic, but simply put, people in all the countries listed above have increasingly limited access to daily meals. And the primary drivers of this: conflict, struggling economies, and climate change. The COP29 climate summit in Baku in November was designated the Finance COP, with many discussions held about climate reparations and justice, and boosting renewables infrastructure in countries that don't have the money to do it themselves. But a lot less focus was put on animal agriculture and the role food plays in our worsening climate.
Do you get the sense that food systems, veganism, the animal agriculture's effect on the planet is one of the core issues here that is being debated and being dealt with?
No, not at all. It never is. It's always fossil fuels, which I mean, it's extremely important. This COP is about finance, most of all, which again is extremely important. But food systems are not really having a place. I mean, they do have a place. They do have negotiation tracks, but it's not really very much talked about. And especially when you talk to delegates, with negotiators, even within the agricultural track, we find an incredibly worrying lack of knowledge on what the animal agriculture role is within the climate crisis, right? Because when it comes to fossil fuels, there is a lot of knowledge. There is sort of a common understanding, but in food systems, like, there is not at all, completely at all. And so we saw some Southeast Asian countries who are very much already plant-based, so they understand the problem very much. They are very aware of the problems that they are having or that they are bringing to the climate crisis when it comes to this topic, but other countries are completely unaware or they just don't want to talk about it.
To be fair, here's some of the food-related announcements that were made at COP29. So the global agriculture industry needs support to weather the storm, so to speak. But on the flip side of the coin, the way we produce food and what we choose to eat can be detrimental to our environment. There is growing consciousness about those issues and even louder calls to eat more sustainably.
3 stages of truth. First is ridicule.
I don't like vegans very much. I don't think any of you look very healthy.
I'm not surprised by that.
Yeah, I think you all look pretty pasty-faced and unhealthy to me.
Second is violent opposition. And third is acceptance.
In order to solve climate change, in order to stay under 1.5 degrees, we can't just transition from fossil fuels. We have to transition from farming animals.
Meat is more or less a status symbol here, and the more money you have, the bigger or the more meat you eat.
But you do want to be on the right side of history when they look back and they're saying, now we know that animal agriculture and climate change are totally connected. And you knew that, and you didn't want to take those steps, early on. You did. You could say you were. You can say you were one of the early adopters.
The issue of animal agriculture and its role in driving climate change is yet again not being given the attention it deserves. And, we know that animal agriculture accounts for more greenhouse gas emissions than like the entire transportation sector. And yet, this conversation is not happening in the way that it needs to be happening. And that's what, it's what is going on psychologically that's preventing people who really care about mitigating climate change from addressing one of the central drivers of this problem.
What's your take on this seeming blockage people have in terms of just talking about it? Because it leads to such ferocious discussions.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is what my research has looked at, which is the psychology of eating animals. I asked the question, why is it that we can't even agree on the facts? Why is it that people get defensive when this issue comes up? Why is it that this issue isn't included in many important conversations? And, we do know that plant proteins, beans, legumes, vegan meat, egg, and dairy alternatives have a vastly lower carbon footprint than do animal proteins, right? And, and yet we rarely talk about using these as replacements and shifting to a plant-based diet. And this is because, in large part, because people are not aware of the invisible bias they have, of this irrational mentality of meat that we've all inherited. Now, this mentality, it distorts our perceptions so that we are strongly biased toward eating animal proteins and against eating plant proteins. And to give you an example of this mentality, I'd like you to just imagine that you are eating a hamburger, and a juicy hamburger, and your dining companion turns to you and tells you, Reagan, this is not a hamburger that you're eating. It's not made from beef. It's actually made from golden retrievers. Yeah. Now, take a moment, right, to think about your thoughts and feelings. Chances are what you just thought of as food, you now think of, you see it for what it is, a dead animal. What you just felt was delicious, you now feel is disgusting. So rather than continue eating that burger, you probably want to throw it in the trash and maybe even take to the streets and protest. Now, your experience of eating what you believe is a golden retriever burger, that's your authentic experience. That's how you would feel about eating a burger from beef or chicken or pigs. If you hadn't been deeply conditioned to have this bias, this irrational mentality that distorts your perceptions and disconnects you from your authentic feelings when it comes to eating animals.
I'm curious about the genesis of this. I know people would say quite often, our ancestors, some were hunter-gatherers, some were worked out in the fields. Some people even have an argument as to our blood type being connected to these lifestyles. For example, I'm an A negative, which means I was not a hunter-gatherer. I worked more, my ancestors, their blood type were used to vegetables and fruits, which is why for some reason I can't metabolize meat well. What do you say to people who say, listen, this is the genesis of the way we eat? What is the genesis of not eating meat? Because you say it's an irrational behavior. Why so?
Yeah, I mean, it's irrational that we love dogs and eat pigs and don't even know why. It's irrational that, for example, in meat-eating cultures around the world, people learn to classify a small handful of animals as edible, and all the rest they classify as inedible. And members of all cultures find their own choices to be rational, and the choices of other cultures to be irrational and often even disgusting and morally offensive, right? There's no rhyme or reason to this mentality. And when we talk about the genesis of the mentality, it's important to understand that this mentality doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is the result of the invisible belief system called Carnism. This belief system is so widespread that it shapes norms, laws, behaviors, beliefs, behaviors, and etc. It shapes all of our major social institutions so that when we study nutrition, we're actually studying carnistic nutrition. So when we look back at human history, and what you're saying is true, I mean, of course, we have been eating animals for thousands of years as part of an omnivorous diet. I don't think anybody would debate that. We have also been killing other humans and raping other humans for just as long, and we do not invoke the longevity of these practices as a justification for them today. When we look at history through the lens of the dominant culture, which is carnism, we look at history in a way that justifies our current carnistic practices. And I think what's important is not to ask how long we've been engaging in a certain behavior, but to say, what are the consequences of this behavior today?
The taste of meat, the flavor, the smell, it's embedded in us somehow. And it's embedded in us so much that the word vegan is gross to people because people associate veganism with bad tasting food that is quite often too high in calories, too high in sugar. Do you think we are still working it out how to make vegan food palatable, or do you think we're there and people are just not curious enough to go find these tasty and healthy treats themselves?
Carnism is structured like other problematic isms, patriarchy, racism, classism, and so on. It's structured in such a way so as to enable compassionate, rational people to engage in uncompassionate, irrational behaviors without realizing what they're doing. And the way it does this is by using these psychological defense mechanisms. And so carnism conditions us. Anybody who's born into a dominant meat-eating culture, which is pretty much everybody today, internalizes these defensiveness. Carnism conditions us to feel defensive against anyone or anything that would help get us out of the carnistic box. So very often people fall back on these, carnistic justifications or, just irrational reasons for continuing with a status quo, a behavior that is causing massive harm to animals, the environment, and their own bodies. The explosion of veganism has been something I never thought I would see in my lifetime. And today it's easier for people who have the economic advantage to make their food choices freely, of course. It's easier than ever to eat well. We don't need everyone in the world to become vegan in order to shift and to massively reduce the consequences of carnism. We just need enough people to be vegan enough. And when it comes to climate advocacy, I think it's critical. We need climate advocates to make animal agriculture a climate priority, to take on big animal ag the way they've taken on big oil. And what this means is that climate advocacy needs to include the demand that governments and institutions be as plant-based as possible.
Organizations like PETA have been trying to use a certain strategy to guilt people into not eating meat or using animals for anything really, imprisoning them particularly as well. People who willfully turn, because I guess there's no other way to put it, people who willfully turn a blind eye to the killing of animals for whatever reason, are they bad people?
Well, that's a great question. And I think it's really important to recognize that eating animals is the result today in modern society of a system, of an entire system that deeply conditions us from the minute we're weaned. We are taught to believe that eating animals is the right thing to do and not eating animals is the wrong thing to do. Good people can and do participate in harmful practices all the time, and that doesn't make them bad people. I think it's really important to really raise awareness, not simply of the consequences of animal agriculture, but of carnism, the system that distorts our perceptions so that we do turn a blind eye to these consequences. People who are already kind of concerned with causing less harm in the world are people who are sometimes, more receptive to this conversation, but anybody can be receptive to the conversation. And again, I think we don't need to present the issue as either you're vegan and you're part of the solution, or you're not vegan and you're part of the problem. We can say that, be as plant-based as possible, be an ally, be a vegan ally. What this means is you reduce your consumption of animals as much as possible, what feels possible for you, and you support the cause. And there are lots of ways you can support the cause through your climate advocacy, by raising awareness of this issue, through donating to, plant-based organizations, and so on.
Were you ever carnivore, omnivore particularly? And if so, what was the turning point for you?
Yeah, I was for a lot of my life. I grew up eating meat. I was actually like the meat lover's pizza girl. I would just get all kinds of meat on my pizza. So I completely relate to the experience of eating animals. And I was also a person, I had been exposed to information about animal agriculture when I was younger, and I wasn't ready or willing to take that information in. So I kind of quickly forgot what I had seen on the news. What happened was that one day I ended up in the hospital because I ate a contaminated hamburger, and I was on intravenous antibiotics. I was extremely ill, and after that experience, I was so disgusted by meat that I just became a vegetarian by accident. But in learning about how to cook for myself, I, of course, stumbled upon information about animal agriculture. This was back in the 80s. I was in my 20s then. And what I learned shocked and horrified me. I just couldn't believe the extent of the harm to animals, to the environment, to my own body. And we didn't know anything back then close to what we know today. But what shocked me in some ways even more was that nobody I talked to about what I was learning was willing to hear what I had to say. They would say things like, "Don't tell me that, you'll ruin my meal," or they'd call me a radical vegan hippie propagandist. And these were rational, compassionate people who cared about other animals and the environment, and, cared about making healthy choices. And so, I became aware of what, I asked this question, what is going on psychologically so people can just stop thinking and feeling when it comes to this vital issue of animal agriculture.
It is clear that our food system is broken. It's unable to feed nearly 800 million chronically hungry people, according to the United Nations. Meanwhile, power Decision-making and ownership over resources are systematically denied to those who work the land. Women, consider this, women farmers contribute to half of global food production, represent 43% of the agricultural workforce, and are responsible for up to 80% of the food in the global south. Yet, they own less than 20% of the land. Experts argue that this inequality lies at the core of both the climate and food crises. Data shows that if women had equal access to resources, including land, it could increase food production by as much as a third and potentially reduce global hunger by 150 million people.
How much access and control do women have over agricultural land in Bangladesh?
Bangladesh is a very conservative country, so it's very much more into the religious perspective, how much land a woman can get or own from her father or from her husband. So the access of to the land of her as a woman is very difficult, but still they are fighting for it in a very different level, from the grassroots level to the regional level to the national level. There is still fighting going on to have a woman their own land.
নারীর ভূমি অধিকার ও ন্যায্যতা এবং জলবায়ু পরিবর্তনে নারীদের ঝুঁকি নিরসনে বাদাবন সংঘ দক্ষিণাঞ্চলে কাজ শুরু করে।
The organization Babadon Sangho provides coaching on land ownership, land grabbing, land literacy. How do you advise women who are looking to own their own land? What do you tell them? How do you help them?
So it starts from the very basic, first of all, do know about your papers. Do you have the national ID card as a citizen? Can you claim yourself that you are a citizen of this country? First of all, it starts with that. And then we cannot go into the very details or description in the very beginning. So it starts with the very basic. So why you do need your land? Why do you need to have your ownership over the land? Why do you need it? That's the very basic thing we teach about.
আমাদের কেন ভূমির প্রয়োজন বলেন তো? বলতে পারবেন? বসত বাড়িতে ভূমির প্রয়োজন, ফসল খাদ্যের চাহিদা মেটাতে ভূমির প্রয়োজন, তারপরে সন্তানের ভবিষ্যৎ নিরাপত্তার জন্য।
If they understand that why they need this land, they will eventually understand that that's the reason I need the land and that's why I need to claim for it. So that's how it begins with. And then we do go-to meetings, we do land literacy trainings, workshops, so that they know how it begins. And then there is specifically we have some trainings which talks about land literacy, land documentation, and also we have connection or the advocacy with the government officials from the Department of Land.
উপকূলীয় অঞ্চলে জলবায়ু পরিবর্তনের কারণে চাষযোগ্য জমিতে লবণাক্ততা বেড়ে যাওয়ায় কমে যাচ্ছে ফসলি জমি। নারীরা উৎপাদনের সাথে সম্পৃক্ত সকল উৎস হারাচ্ছে, যেমন কৃষিকাজ বন্ধ, মৎস্য শিকার অনেকাংশে বন্ধ, গবাদি পশুপালন বন্ধ হয়েছে।
In your line of work, you often refer to male-dominated community leadership, and you've described something called the dalal, which is a middleman who somehow obstructs women from getting ahead. What do you think is at the core of this systemic form of suppression? Do you think men are afraid of women?
It's basically most of it comes from the culture. The culture we are used to in. It's more like men dominant. And as I said, the religious comes again in very various religious perspective. It is said that the men are tend to have more control over women because women are technically very sensitive and not capable of taking decisions in their own life. So it's more over taking control over a woman's life by a man. And when they're taking control over the woman's life, they're taking control over her education, they're taking control over her decision making, they're taking control over her land ownership.
হলো 13টা ভাই বোন, আমি একা আল্লাহর মার, আমি জমি জমা খাতে পারি না, তারাই খায় ভোগ দখলে থাকে, কিন্তু আমিও অসহায় পড়ে আছি।
বাপের বাড়ির সম্পত্তি আমি ছেলে যদি পাই তাহলে আমি মেয়ে হিসেবে কেন পাবো না?
নারীদের দলবদ্ধভাবে ভূমি আইন এবং নারী অধিকার বিষয়ে ট্রেনিং আমরা করে থাকি এবং নারীরাই এইগুলো পরিচালনা করে থাকে।
And that's our show. Food is personal to each of us. We share it with our friends, family, What we eat is tied to culture, traditions, ancient customs. That's why working toward a just and sustainable food system is more important than ever, so that we can honor nature and ensure that hundreds of millions who go to bed hungry each night are fed. A change is possible, but only if we first recognize that the system we have needs urgent transformation.